October 25th, 1944. A Japanese aircraft smashes straight through the flight deck of the escort carrier USS St. Violent internal explosions tear the ship apart, sending her to the bottom of the ocean, along with over 100 American sailors. Naval warfare has changed in an instant. Enemy planes are now guided anti-ship missiles that must be stopped miles away. Ironically, the United States Navy already possessed the perfect high-speed interceptor to do exactly that. Yet, they had deliberately banished it from their own carriers. What was this exiled weapon, and why did the fleet consider it too dangerous for the very decks it was built to defend? That aircraft was the Vought F4U Corsair. It was designed from the ground up as a dedicated carrier-based fighter, boasting unmatched speed, extreme operational range, and devastating firepower. On paper, it was the ultimate naval interceptor. Yet for nearly 2 years of the Pacific War, this technological marvel was conspicuously absent from the American fleet at sea. Instead of launching from the wooden decks of fast carriers, the Corsair fought almost exclusively from muddy, coral-strewn island airstrips. The United States Navy had deliberately sidelined its most capable combat aircraft. Naval commanders concluded that bringing the Corsair aboard a ship posed a greater threat to their own aviators than the Japanese military did. Why did the Navy refuse to deploy a machine that could outrun and outgun anything in the sky? And how did the sheer existential terror of the kamikaze threat finally force the fleet to swallow its pride, reverse a rigid operational doctrine, and summon this exiled fighter back to sea? To understand how an aircraft built specifically for the ocean ended up banished to the dirt, we have to go back to its very inception, to a design phase where an uncompromising obsession with raw engine power created a machine that was absolutely terrifying to fly. That obsession with raw power began in the drafting rooms of the Vought Aircraft Company. Chief Engineer Rex Beisel did not merely design an airplane to carry an engine. He built an airframe shrink-wrapped around the largest, most brutal power plant available. That engine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder, 2,000 horsepower monster. To convert that staggering raw power into forward thrust, the aircraft required a massive Hamilton Standard propeller, spanning over 13 feet across. It was the largest propeller ever fitted to a fighter aircraft. But this immense propeller created an immediate, glaring engineering paradox. To keep the blade tips from striking the ground during takeoff and landing, the aircraft needed exceptionally tall landing gear. Yet, tall, spindly landing gear would instantly snap under the crushing vertical impact of dropping onto a pitching carrier deck. Beisel's solution was the now iconic inverted gull wing. By bending the wings down from the fuselage and then back up to the tips, the main landing gear could be mounted at the lowest structural point. This kept the struts short, heavy, and practically indestructible, while still giving the giant propeller the clearance it demanded. In the air, this uncompromising design was an absolute masterpiece. In 1940, the prototype shattered records, becoming the first American single-engine fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. The aerodynamics were flawless when the throttle was wide open and the aircraft was in its element. However, a carrier landing is the exact opposite of wide-open flight. It is a highly controlled crash. A naval aviator must fly his machine at the razor's edge of its stall speed, perfectly aligned, dropping out of the sky onto a short, rolling, wooden runway that is constantly moving away from him. In this unforgiving environment, the Corsair's breathtaking aerial supremacy transformed into a nightmare of physics. The very features that made it a lethal predator in the sky made it a lethal threat to its own pilots in the landing pattern. Engineering ambition violently collided with human limitations. The fatal flaws revealed themselves one by one during carrier qualification trials. First was the blinding forward visibility. Because the massive engine was so thirsty, engineers placed a 237-gallon main fuel tank right at the aircraft's center of gravity, directly behind the power plant. This forced the cockpit incredibly far back along the fuselage. The pilot was effectively sitting behind 14 feet of engine cowling and aviation fuel. As the aircraft slowed for a carrier approach, it flew with a high nose-up attitude. That immense nose completely blotted out the flight deck. During the most critical life-or-death seconds of the landing, the pilot was flying totally blind, forced to look out the side of the canopy just to catch a glimpse of the landing signal officer standing on the edge of the ship. If a pilot somehow managed to navigate the approach without seeing where he was going, the aerodynamics betrayed him. As the Corsair bled off speed, approaching the threshold of the deck, the unique airflow over the gull wing created a deadly quirk. Without any vibration through the control stick or warning of any kind, the left wing would abruptly lose lift and stall. At high altitude, a pilot could easily recover, but 50 feet above the churning wake of an aircraft carrier, a violent left wing drop meant the aircraft would instantly snap roll and plunge directly into the ship's steel stern or the ocean. Even if a pilot kept the wings perfectly level and slammed onto the wooden deck, the landing gear introduced a third hazard. The stiff oleo struts were designed to absorb extreme force, but they were vastly overpressurized. Instead of soaking up the impact, they acted like massive steel pogo sticks. The heavy fighter would strike the deck and violently bounce right back into the air. In that terrifying bounce, the tailhook would sail straight over the steel arresting wires, leaving the massive aircraft hurtling unarrested toward the parked planes at the bow of the ship. At this exact moment, the pilot was forced to execute a wave-off, slamming the throttle completely forward to abort the landing, gain airspeed, and escape. This triggered the fourth and most lethal flaw. Injecting 2,000 horsepower into a 13-foot propeller in a fraction of a second generated colossal engine torque. At low speed, this sudden twisting force overwhelmed the flight controls, brutally rolling the aircraft onto its back. Pilots who tried to execute a simple wave-off to save themselves often found their planes flipping inverted, plunging upside down into the sea, or smashing into the deck. The death toll and the accident rates during training flights were entirely unacceptable. Facing these compounding hazards, the United States Navy made a pragmatic, cold-blooded calculation. They were rapidly expanding the fleet and churning out thousands of new, relatively inexperienced aviators to fight a two-front global war. They needed a fighter that wouldn't actively try to kill its operator during a routine recovery. The Navy turned instead to the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was slightly slower, with less extreme performance, but it was forgiving, predictable, and offered a clear view over the nose. It was exactly what the fleet needed to safely mass-produce naval air power. Consequently, the Navy officially deemed the F4U Corsair unsuitable for carrier operations. The finest naval interceptor ever built was formally stripped of its naval role. Instead, the Navy handed the unforgiving machine over to the United States Marine Corps. The Marines were locked in a grueling, bloody island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, operating from static, dirt runways carved out of jungles and coral reefs. On a long, stationary strip that didn't pitch or roll, the Corsair's lethal carrier flaws were manageable, and so the thoroughbred naval fighter was exiled to the mud, flying from bases in Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, banished far from the pristine wooden decks of the fast carrier strike groups. The story seems settled. The Navy had its safe, dependable Hellcats. The Marines had their hot rod Corsairs tied to the dirt. The official narrative was locked in, etched into standard operating procedure. The Corsair was simply too dangerous for a ship. But in the crucible of war, official pronouncements are rarely the final word. The verdict handed down by the Navy brass was not an absolute law of physics. It was a choice born of convenience and a fear of peacetime accident rates. It was a conclusion that masked a deeper question. Was the aircraft truly impossible to tame, Or had the fleet simply surrendered to its flaws prematurely? The answer to that question came almost immediately, not from the engineers who built the plane, but from the aviators who refused to give up on it. The myth that the Corsair was fundamentally incapable of carrier operations had spread rapidly through the ranks of naval aviation, but it was ultimately just a myth. In late 1943, the pilots of Fighter Squadron VF-17, famously known as the Jolly Rogers, systematically dismantled this official narrative. Under the command of John Blackburn, these men didn't just learn to fly the beast, they learned to tame it. They pushed through the grueling carrier qualification process, proving that a skilled, disciplined pilot could master the blinding nose, manage the left wing stall, and conquer the violent torque. The definitive proof arrived in November 1943 during the intense American carrier strikes on the heavily fortified Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. When the fleet came under heavy aerial counterattack, the land-based Jolly Rogers flew out to provide a defensive combat air patrol. Running dangerously low on fuel and ammunition over the open ocean, the Corsairs did not turn back for their distant island airstrips. Instead, they dropped their tailhooks and entered the landing pattern for the fast carrier USS Bunker Hill. In the middle of a chaotic combat zone, surrounded by the tension of an active strike operation, Blackburn's pilots executed flawless deck landings. They trapped on the arresting wires, refueled, rearmed, and roared right back off the wooden deck to continue the fight. They proved beyond any doubt that while the aircraft was undeniably demanding, it was absolutely not a hopeless widowmaker. Yet, despite this undeniable display of combat capability, the Jolly Rogers were ordered to leave the ships. They were sent back to the mud and coral of the Solomon Islands. The hidden truth behind the Corsair's exile wasn't just the physics of its landing gear or the restricted visibility from its cockpit. It was the ruthless, rigid logic of wartime logistics. An aircraft carrier is a floating, isolated warehouse, and space below deck is severely limited. Stocking spare parts, specialized tools, and mechanics for two entirely different fighter aircraft created a logistical nightmare. The Navy brass looked at the sprawling Pacific supply chains and made a choice born of bureaucratic convenience. The Hellcat was deemed good enough to beat the Japanese Zero, and maintaining an all-Hellcat fighter fleet streamlined maintenance, training, and resupply across the entire theater. Raw combat capability was sacrificed to protect a comfortable logistical doctrine. The American fast carriers sailed deeper into the Pacific, their decks packed with safe, predictable Hellcats, leaving their most potent interceptor marooned on the beaches. But the Corsair's story at sea was not over. While the United States Navy sailed away from the demanding fighter, another fleet was watching closely. Across the Atlantic, the British Royal Navy was fighting a desperate war of survival, and they simply could not afford the luxury of waiting for the perfect airplane. The Royal Navy was fighting a radically different kind of war, and they simply did not possess the sprawling, luxurious logistical safety net that the American fleets enjoyed in the Pacific. For the British, naval aviation in the early 1940s was an absolute existential crisis of survival. They were operating in the brutal, freezing conditions of the North Atlantic, the confined and highly contested waters of the Mediterranean, and the unforgiving Arctic Ocean. In these theaters, the Royal Navy desperately required a fighter that possessed extreme operational range, overwhelming firepower, and a physical airframe rugged enough to withstand the relentless pounding of heavy seas and heavily armored flight decks. Their primary indigenous carrier fighter was the Supermarine Seafire, essentially a modified Spitfire adapted for naval use. While the Seafire was a magnificent interceptor in terms of pure aerial agility, it was dangerously fragile. Its narrow-track undercarriage was notoriously weak, snapping with alarming regularity when slammed onto the pitching steel decks of British carriers in rough weather. Furthermore, the Seafire lacked the long operational range required to project power deep into enemy territory without exposing the carrier strike groups to devastating land-based bomber attacks. The British had also utilized the Grumman Martlet, the export version of the American Wildcat, but by late 1943, This aircraft was rapidly becoming obsolete, thoroughly outclassed by the newer, faster fighters entering the global conflict. The Admiralty in London was looking at a glaring tactical deficit. When they analyzed the performance data of the Vought F4U Corsair, they saw a machine that perfectly matched their most desperate strategic requirements. It was built like a flying bridge, it possessed an immense combat radius, and it carried enough firepower to shatter enemy bombers before they could reach the fleet. The fact that the United States Navy considered the aircraft too dangerous to land on a ship was, to the British High Command, a secondary concern. The Royal Navy did not have the luxury of waiting for an easier, safer alternative. Through the Lend-Lease program, the British eagerly accepted the exact same temperamental fighter that the American fleet was currently holding at arm's length. But the British did not simply accept the Corsair's fatal flaws. They systematically engineered their way out of them. What followed was one of the most remarkable transatlantic engineering collaborations of the Second World War. Vought engineers, United States Navy test pilots, and brilliant British aviation tacticians began a concerted, collaborative effort to dismantle the aircraft's lethal reputation piece by piece. The first major hurdle to overcome was the terrifying landing bounce. The stiff, heavily pressurized oleostruts of the main landing gear had been turning the 14,000-pound fighter into a massive pogo stick, causing the tailhook to cleanly sail over the arresting wires. The engineering solution was elegantly simple, but fundamentally transformative. Mechanics bled off the excessive high-pressure hydraulic fluid and installed a modified bleeder valve system inside the struts. Instead of acting as a rigid spring that violently returned the kinetic energy of the impact, the newly modified two-stage strut slowly absorbed and dissipated the extreme downward force. When the heavy fighter slammed onto the wooden deck, the gear now compressed smoothly, keeping the aircraft planted firmly on the boards and ensuring the tailhook dragged securely across the steel cables. The deadly bounce was entirely eliminated. The next aerodynamic puzzle was the terrifying left-wing stall. As the Corsair bled off speed during the final seconds of a landing approach, the unique airflow traveling over the iconic inverted gull wing caused the left side to abruptly lose lift before the right, violently snapping the aircraft into an uncontrollable roll just 50 feet above the water. Engineers realized they could not easily redesign the entire aerodynamic profile of the wing without severely compromising the aircraft's legendary top speed. Instead, they opted for a brilliantly crude aerodynamic hack. They bolted a simple 6-inch strip of wood, a stall strip, directly onto the leading edge of the starboard wing. This tiny modification artificially disrupted the airflow over the right wing just enough so that it would lose lift at the exact same millisecond as the left wing. The result was instantaneous. The violent, unpredictable snap roll was replaced by a straightforward, symmetrical, and entirely manageable loss of altitude. If a pilot got too slow, the aircraft would simply sink straight down, remaining wings level, giving the aviator the critical fraction of a second needed to push the throttle forward and recover. Solving the mechanical and aerodynamic flaws was a massive leap forward, but it did not solve the primary human problem. The pilot still could not see the flight deck. The massive Pratt & Whitney engine and the relocated fuel tank meant the aviator was sitting too low and too far back. Vought addressed the first part of this visibility crisis by literally raising the pilot seat by 7 inches, completely redesigning the cockpit layout, and discarding the heavily framed, restrictive birdcage canopy. In its place, they installed a clear, blown plexiglass bubble canopy, heavily influenced by the British Malcolm hood used on later Spitfires. This vastly improved the pilot's peripheral vision and allowed them to look slightly over the massive cowling. But better glass was not enough. To truly conquer the blindness of the final approach, The British Fleet Air Arm had to fundamentally rewrite the rulebook of naval aviation. The standard American aircraft carrier landing pattern was a rigid geometric exercise. A pilot would fly a downwind leg parallel to the ship, execute a sharp turn, line up directly astern of the carrier, and fly a long, straight, flat glide path toward the deck. For the Corsair, this straight-in approach was an absolute death sentence because the massive nose completely eclipsed the ship for the last critical quarter mile. The Royal Navy pilots threw this standard operating procedure out the window. They invented the continuous curved approach. Instead of lining up far behind the ship and flying straight, the British pilots initiated a slow, descending, continuous left-hand turn that did not end until the very moment the wheels touched the deck. By keeping the aircraft in a steady bank, the massive nose was angled slightly away from the carrier. The pilot kept his eyes locked on the ship and the landing signal officer by looking out the lower left side of his clear canopy. The flight deck remained in perfect, unobstructed view throughout the entire descent. Only at the very last second, as the aircraft crossed the threshold of the stern, did the pilot snap the wings level, chop the throttle, and drop into the arresting wires. This revolutionary flying technique transformed a blind, terrifying plunge into a highly controlled, visual ballet. There was one final, purely British logistical obstacle to overcome. The Royal Navy's illustrious class fleet carriers were designed differently than their American counterparts. Because they operated in the enclosed waters of the Mediterranean and within range of heavy land-based European bombers, British carriers featured heavily armored enclosed hangar decks. This armor plating provided excellent defense, but it severely reduced the overhead clearance inside the hangar. When the Corsair folded its massive gull wings vertically, the wingtips were simply too tall to fit below the British ceilings. The aircraft literally could not be stowed away. The British engineering solution was brutally pragmatic. They took industrial saws and simply chopped exactly 8 inches off each wingtip, squaring off the ends of the beautiful elliptical design. This crude amputation successfully lowered the folded height of the aircraft just enough to slide into the armored hangars. But the modification produced a completely unintended and highly fortuitous aerodynamic side effect. By shortening the wingspan and squaring the tips, the engineers actually increased the aircraft's roll rate, making it more maneuverable in a tight dogfight. Even more importantly for carrier operations, the clipped wings reduced the aircraft's tendency to float in the ground effect just above the deck. The clipped wing Corsair dropped more predictably and firmly onto the arresting wires. Through mechanical ingenuity, aerodynamic tweaking, and a radical reinvention of flying techniques, the British and their American engineering partners had systematically dismantled every single excuse keeping the Corsair off a flight deck. The ultimate proof of this monumental engineering and tactical effort arrived on the 3rd of April, 1944, in the freezing, hostile waters of the Arctic Ocean. The Royal Navy launched Operation Tungsten, a massive, coordinated carrier strike aimed at neutralizing the Tirpitz, the terrifying sister ship to the Bismarck, which was heavily fortified in a remote Norwegian fjord. The strike force was built around Fairey Barracuda dive bombers, but they required high-altitude top cover to protect them from the anticipated Luftwaffe fighter interception. For this critical role, the Fleet Air Arm deployed their newly modified Corsairs from the pitching, icy deck of the fleet carrier HMS Victorious. Launching a massive, high-performance fighter from a rolling deck in the turbulent air of the Arctic Circle was the ultimate stress test. The Corsairs roared off the wooden flight deck, formed up in the freezing, overcast skies, and provided a flawless, impenetrable defensive umbrella over the striking dive bombers. Following the successful attack that heavily damaged the German battleship, the Corsairs returned to the fleet, executed their sweeping, continuous curved approaches, and trapped safely onto the arresting wires of HMS Victorious. The operation was an unmitigated triumph. The Royal Navy had definitively proven that the F4U Corsair was not only viable for major naval operations, but that it could excel in the most challenging and unforgiving maritime environments on the planet. The technical puzzle was solved. The beast had been tamed. Yet, while the British were confidently launching and recovering Corsairs in the North Atlantic, the war on the opposite side of the globe was undergoing a terrifying, fundamental transformation. The Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific was actively observing the sprawling, unstoppable American air fleets, and what they saw terrified them. By the latter half of 1944, the Japanese aviation forces were bleeding to death. The brutal, grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign and the catastrophic, one-sided slaughter during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, famously known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, had entirely wiped out their irreplaceable cadre of pre-war, highly trained veteran aviators. The Japanese air groups were now hastily replenished with incredibly brave but desperately undertrained young men who possessed barely enough flight hours to safely navigate their aircraft, let alone engage in complex aerial combat. These novice Japanese pilots were being thrown against an impenetrable, radar-directed wall of American F-6F Hellcats. The traditional mechanics of naval aerial warfare had completely broken down for the Japanese Empire. In a conventional attack, a strike package of dive bombers and torpedo planes required fighter escorts to engage and distract the enemy's combat air patrol. The bombers then had to survive a gauntlet of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, execute a highly precise bombing run on a moving ship, and survive the journey back to their bases. The Japanese High Command looked at this complex tactical sequence and realized with cold, mathematical certainty that they no longer possessed the pilot skill or the aircraft performance to execute it. A novice pilot attempting to dogfight a veteran American aviator in a Hellcat was a guaranteed loss. The Japanese could no longer penetrate the American defense screen and survive. This stark, inescapable realization led Japanese strategists, notably Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, to a conclusion of terrifying, brutal logic. If the traditional attack sequence was mathematically impossible, and if surviving the American defense screen was no longer achievable, then the requirement for survival had to be entirely removed from the tactical equation. The objective of an attack could no longer be to drop a weapon on a ship and return home. The objective had to be the aircraft itself becoming the weapon. If a pilot did not need to know how to evade enemy fighters, how to execute a complex defensive weave, or how to navigate back to a distant airfield, his lack of training suddenly ceased to be a critical liability. He only needed to know how to push the throttle forward, enter a steep dive, and physically steer his fuel-heavy aircraft directly into the wooden flight deck of an American aircraft carrier. This was the dark, desperate birth of the special attack units, the Kamikaze. This tactical paradigm shift fundamentally altered the physics and the timeline of a naval engagement. An aircraft diving at terminal velocity, flown by a pilot who actively refuses to take evasive action, drastically shrinks the window of opportunity for an interception. The Japanese planes were no longer maneuvering fighters. They were manned, high-speed anti-ship missiles. To stop them, an intercepting aircraft did not need the prolonged turning ability required for a dogfight. It required raw, overwhelming speed. It required the ability to climb to extreme altitudes faster than the enemy, dash across miles of open ocean in a fraction of the time, and obliterate the incoming threat long before it entered the visual range of the fleet. The Japanese had unknowingly shifted the entire tactical landscape in a way that made the sheer, unadulterated speed and climbing power of the Vought Corsair the most vital characteristic in the Pacific theater. Back in Washington and at the Pacific Fleet headquarters in Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy remained blissfully unaware of this impending tactical apocalypse. The American admirals were staring at their sprawling logistical empires and feeling a profound sense of operational security. The United States Navy was fully aware of the British successes with the Corsair. American liaison officers had observed the curved approaches. They had tested the modified oleo struts, and they had seen the after-action reports from Operation Tungsten. The technical hurdles that had originally banished the Corsair to the dirt airstrips of the Marine Corps had been definitively cleared. The United States Navy possessed the absolute confirmation that the Corsair could safely operate from a fast carrier. Yet, they stubbornly refused to bring it back to the fleet. The reasoning was no longer rooted in the safety of the pilots, but rather in the rigid, comfortable inertia of a massive military bureaucracy. The Fast Carrier Task Force was operating as a highly tuned machine of mass production. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was shooting down hundreds of Japanese aircraft in conventional turning dogfights. The Hellcat was deemed perfectly adequate for the job at hand. More importantly, maintaining an all-Hellcat fighter fleet across the Pacific simplified an incredibly complex supply chain. Introducing the Corsair back onto the carriers meant stocking different spare parts, deploying specialized Pratt & Whitney engine mechanics, altering fuel loadouts, and retraining maintenance crews across dozens of isolated ships. The American High Command looked at the solved technical puzzle of the Corsair and made a deliberate choice to prioritize administrative unity and logistical convenience over maximum interceptor performance. They had built a perfectly efficient machine for the war they had been fighting since 1943. They were completely content to let the Marines keep the demanding thoroughbreds on the islands, confident that their wall of reliable Hellcats would continue to comfortably dominate the skies. It was a profound sense of perfect security, built upon the fatal assumption that the enemy would continue to fight by the old rules. But the American fleet was now steaming relentlessly westward, pushing deep into the Philippine Sea, fundamentally unaware that the rules of naval warfare had just been violently rewritten in the minds of the Japanese High Command. The United States Navy's comfortable reliance on bureaucratic efficiency and conventional air superiority was sailing directly toward an unprecedented existential nightmare that was about to shatter their skies. The brutal awakening occurred in late October 1944, during the massive American invasion of the Philippines. When the first organized kamikaze units struck the United States fleet off Leyte Gulf, the comfortable tactical doctrines of the American Navy collapsed in blood and fire. The Japanese were no longer trying to outmaneuver the American Hellcats in the sky. They didn't care about turning radius or defensive weaves. They simply put their aircraft into steep, high-velocity dives and hurled themselves directly at the decks of the fleet. This terrifying new reality instantly broke the traditional math of naval aviation. The Hellcat was a magnificent dogfighter, but its primary strength, its stable, forgiving maneuverability, was suddenly irrelevant against a target that refused to maneuver. When radar operators detected an incoming Japanese raid 50 miles out, the fleet desperately needed an interceptor that could reach that distance in minutes, climb to extreme altitude faster than the enemy, and shatter the incoming planes with overwhelming speed and firepower before they could enter their final, terminal dives. The American fleet commanders stared at the burning wreckage of ships like the USS St. and realized with chilling clarity that their defensive screen was too slow to catch an apocalyptic threat. The bureaucratic excuses that had kept the Corsair off the decks instantly evaporated. The operational risk of losing a single Corsair to a bounced landing or a stalled wing was abruptly dwarfed by the existential terror of losing an entire fleet carrier and thousands of sailors to a single Japanese aircraft that the Hellcats couldn't catch in time. The margin for error had vanished entirely. The United States Navy urgently required the fastest, most powerful interceptor on Earth to build an impenetrable shield miles away from the task force. and they knew exactly where to find it. They just had to make a desperate phone call to the Marines they had exiled to the mud. The order from Naval Headquarters was immediate and absolute. On December 28, 1944, the rigid bureaucratic barriers that had kept the United States Marine Corps tied to land bases completely dissolved. The Navy urgently recalled Marine Fighter Squadrons VMF 124 and VMF 213 directly out of their muddy, coral-strewn island airstrips and dropped them squarely onto the pristine flight deck of the fleet carrier USS Essex. There was no time for prolonged transition periods or extensive logistical debates. The fleet was bleeding and it needed raw speed. These Marine aviators, flying the very machine the Navy had deemed too dangerous to bring aboard a ship, were suddenly thrust into the most critical defensive role in the Pacific theater. The exiled fighter had officially returned to the sea. As the American Armada pushed relentlessly closer to the Japanese home islands, engaging in the grueling, blood-soaked campaigns over Iwo Jima and the agonizing meat grinder of Okinawa, the Corsair finally fulfilled its original designed destiny. The airspace above the fleet had transformed into a chaotic, terrifying arena of high-velocity intercepts. When combat information centers detected incoming waves of kamikazes, the Corsairs were catapulted into the sky, utilizing the immense power of the R2800 double wasp engine to climb at a staggering rate. The sheer speed of the aircraft allowed Marine and naval aviators to close the distance rapidly, slashing through the incoming formations with ruthless mechanical efficiency. The Corsair was no longer just an airplane. It was the ultimate kinetic shield for the fleet. It possessed the raw horsepower to chase down diving Japanese attackers and the devastating firepower of 6 .50 caliber machine guns to shatter the incoming flying bombs before they could penetrate the fleet's perimeter. In the frantic, smoke-filled skies over the Pacific, the high-speed interceptor proved to be the exact countermeasure required to blunt the edge of the kamikaze threat. The historical irony of this moment was profound and inescapable. The United States Navy had officially banished the F4U Corsair because they considered its landing characteristics far too dangerous for their own pilots. The aircraft had been exiled because it struggled to safely return to a carrier deck. Yet, in the darkest, most desperate hours of the naval war, this exact same machine was urgently summoned back to those very flight decks for one specific overriding purpose: to hunt down and stop enemy pilots who had absolutely no intention of landing at all. The Corsair was forced to do more than just survive the kamikaze threat in the Pacific. It had defeated a much more stubborn opponent back home. It had ultimately conquered the deep-seated institutional distrust of the massive American military bureaucracy. For nearly 2 years, the United States Navy allowed logistical convenience and a rigid adherence to safety doctrines to dictate its combat strategy. The admirals possessed an unparalleled engineering marvel, yet they chose to leave it parked on distant beaches because taming the beast required disrupting the comfortable, predictable rhythm of their fast carrier operations. It took the apocalyptic shock of October 25, 1944, to permanently shatter that administrative complacency. The horrifying reality of the USS St. burning and sinking beneath the waves proved that warfare does not respect bureaucratic convenience. The arrival of the kamikaze fundamentally broke the traditional rules of naval engagement, and in doing so, it exposed a hard, universal truth about military institutions. A rigid system will always resist adaptation until the cost of not changing becomes a matter of absolute survival. The sheer terror of the suicide planes forced a proud naval command to silently admit a massive doctrinal mistake. The fleet had to abandon its pursuit of the perfectly safe, mass-producible carrier landing and fully embrace the unforgiving, highly complex reality of maximum aerodynamic performance. Faced with an enemy that defied all logical military doctrine, the United States Navy was compelled to rapidly mobilize the exact weapon it had prematurely rejected as too dangerous to handle. In the brutal crucible of total war, the enemy always dictates the ultimate timeline, and a radically evolving threat will inevitably override established peacetime procedures. The Vought Corsair did not somehow change its fundamental nature to finally win its rightful place on the wooden flight decks. Instead, the terrifying, high-speed reality of the Pacific War simply caught up to the extreme, uncompromising capabilities of the machine. The F4U Corsair was born as a violent compromise between raw horsepower and carrier safety, and for years, the illusion of safety won. But when the terrifying reality of the Kamikaze completely shattered the rules of naval combat, a rigid military bureaucracy had no choice but to embrace the beasts they had exiled. The aircraft never compromised its unforgiving nature to finally earn its place back on those wooden decks. The fleet simply realized that the exact danger they once feared on the runway was the only thing that could save them in the sky.